The panther was lying where the road turned to dirt. Daniel Mwanga saw it from 30 meters out, though he did not know what it was at first. The evening light had begun its slow retreat from the jungle, pulling color from the canopy and leaving behind a world rendered in grays and deep greens. And in that fading half-light, the shape at the edge of the gravel looked like nothing more than a fallen limb. A thick branch, perhaps, brought down by the afternoon rains that had swept through the Kahuzi Reserve 3 hours earlier, leaving the air heavy and close and smelling of turned earth. He eased his foot off the accelerator and let the truck coast forward, more out of habit than concern. 22 years of driving these roads had taught him to slow down for anything that interrupted the line of the path. Fallen trees could hide sinkholes, debris could conceal snakes, and sometimes, though rarely, the shape on the road was not a shape at all, but a living thing that had wandered out of the forest and into the narrow corridor of human passage for reasons only it understood. The truck rolled closer. The headlights, pale against the lingering dusk, swept across the object and caught something that made Daniel's hands tighten on the wheel. A sheen, not the dry, rough texture of bark, but something smooth and faintly reflective, like oiled leather left out in the rain. He stopped the truck entirely, leaving the engine idling, and leaned forward over the steering column to peer through the windshield. The shape was pressed against the very edge of the gravel where the road met the overgrown grass, and it was long, perhaps 1.5 meters from one end to the other, and it was curved slightly inward, as though whatever it was had drawn itself into the smallest version of itself it could manage. And then, as Daniel watched, the shape moved. Not dramatically, not with any force or intention, but with the slow, involuntary rhythm of something breathing. A rise, a fall, a pause that lasted a beat too long, another rise. He turned off the engine. The silence that followed was not truly silence. The jungle never permitted silence. Instead, it offered its own version of quiet, a layered composition of insect song and distant bird calls and the soft, persistent dripping of water from leaves, still heavy with rain. A hornbill called once from somewhere in the upper canopy, a single note that rang out, and then dissolved into the warm air like a stone dropping into deep water. The trees stood motionless, their trunks dark and massive, their roots gripping the earth in tangled networks that ran beneath the road itself. Epiphytes clung to the branches in thick clusters, their leaves catching the last traces of light and holding it there, pale green against the darkening sky. The air was warm, almost uncomfortably so, and saturated with moisture that sat on the skin like a second layer of clothing. It smelled of wet bark, of decomposing leaves, of the rich and complicated life cycle of a forest that had been growing and dying and growing again for longer than any human record could account for. Daniel reached for the spotlight mounted to the roof of the cab. It was a handheld unit, heavy and slightly dented from years of use, and he angled it through the open window and switched it on. The beam cut through the dusk like a blade, white and sharp, and landed squarely on the shape at the road's edge. Black fur, short, dense, and slicked flat by the rain. A body built for power and silence, compact through the shoulders, long through the spine, the muscles visible even at rest beneath the coat. A melanistic leopard. The locals had always called them shadow cats, a name that Daniel had heard since childhood and never once corrected, because it was, in its own way, more accurate than anything the field guides offered. This animal was shadow made solid, darkness given weight and breath and bone, and it was lying on its side in the gravel, with its head turned slightly toward the road, its eyes half open, and its body so still that if not for that faint, troubled breathing, Daniel would have thought it dead. He did not move. He sat in the truck with the spotlight trained on the animal and studied it with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who understood that the first minutes of any encounter with a wounded predator determined whether the encounter ended in rescue or in tragedy. The panther was young, 3 years old, perhaps 4, based on the size and the proportions of the skull. Female, he thought, though he could not be certain from this angle. The coat was in good condition despite the rain, which suggested the animal had been healthy and well fed before whatever had happened to bring it here. The eyes, half-lidded and glassy, caught the spotlight's beam and reflected it back in 2 dull points of amber, but there was no reaction behind them, no flinch, no narrowing of the pupils. The animal was conscious, but only barely, hovering in that gray territory between awareness and something deeper and more dangerous. Then he saw the leg. The left hind leg was extended slightly behind the body, twisted outward at an angle that no healthy joint would permit. Along the inner thigh, running from just above the knee nearly to the hip, was a wound. It was deep, the edges ragged and darkened with dried blood that had mixed with rain and mud to form a crust the color of rust. The flesh around it was swollen and tight, distended in a way that spoke of hours, possibly a full day, of unchecked inflammation. And caught in the center of the wound, half buried in the torn tissue, was a thin loop of wire. It glinted in the spotlight, a small, cruel crescent of metal that Daniel recognized instantly. Motorcycle brake cable, twisted into a self-tightening noose and anchored, somewhere back in the forest, to a tree or a stake driven into the ground. A poacher's snare. Daniel exhaled slowly. He had found animals in snares before, more times than he could count, and more times than he cared to remember. Bush pigs with their legs worn to bone, duikers strangled by loops meant for larger prey. Once, years ago, a young gorilla with a wire so deeply embedded in its wrist that the hand had turned black and begun to die. Each time, the anger came first, hot and sharp and useless, and each time he pushed it aside and did what needed to be done. Anger did not free animals from wire. Steady hands and calm decisions did. He studied the panther's breathing again. The rhythm was wrong, too shallow, too quick, with pauses between breaths that stretched a half-second longer than they should have. The animal was in shock, or approaching it, the body beginning to shut down non-essential systems in order to keep the vital organs functioning. He estimated the panther's weight at 50 to 55 kilograms. At that size, with that degree of blood loss and tissue damage, the window for intervention was measured in hours, not days. He reached for the radio on the dashboard. It was an old unit, scratched and faded, the frequency dial stiff from years of humidity and dust. He pressed the transmit button and spoke in a voice that was calm and level, the voice of a man delivering facts rather than feelings. Base, this is Mwanga on the South Access Road, approximately 4 kilometers past the Lulingu Junction. I have a black leopard down at the roadside. Female, estimated 3 to 4 years. Snare injury to the left hind leg, deep laceration with embedded wire. Significant swelling, probable early infection. The animal is conscious but non-responsive. I am requesting the veterinary team and a transport crate. Please advise on estimated arrival. The radio hissed and popped. A voice came back, thin and broken by static, relaying from the base station 18 kilometers to the north. Copy, Daniel. Veterinary team is being contacted. Estimated arrival is 40 minutes. Do not approach the animal. Repeat, do not approach. He set the radio down on the passenger seat and looked back through the windshield at the panther. The animal had not moved. Its eyes had closed fully now, and its breathing had settled into a pattern that was either stabilizing or simply surrendering. The spotlight still held it in its white circle, and against the dark gravel and the darker wall of jungle beyond, the panther looked impossibly small. Not the apex predator of textbooks and documentaries, not the shadow cat of local legend, but simply an animal, young and wounded and alone, on a road it had no reason to be on, unless every other option had already failed. Daniel switched off the spotlight. The darkness returned, thick and complete, and the panther disappeared into it as though it had never been there at all. But he could hear it. He could hear that breathing, faint and ragged, rising and falling in the warm air between them. "I'm not going anywhere," he said quietly, to no one and to the dark. He settled back in his seat, rested his hands on the steering wheel, and waited. The jungle pressed in around the truck, immense and indifferent and alive, and somewhere inside it, beyond the road and the gravel and the small circle of human presence, the night continued its ancient, unhurried work. Daniel listened. The panther breathed, and the darkness held them both in its open, patient hands, offering nothing, asking nothing, simply being there, the way it always had been and always would be, long after the roads were gone and the trucks were rust, and the only thing left was the forest and the creatures it had made. The headlights appeared through the trees before the sound of the engine reached him, 2 pale beams swinging through the undergrowth as the veterinary van navigated the final curve of the South Access Road. Daniel watched them approach without moving from his seat. He had been sitting in the dark for 46 minutes, his window down, his hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the panther breathe. The rhythm had not changed. It had not improved, but it had not worsened either, and in the arithmetic of wildlife rescue, holding steady was sometimes the most one could hope for. The van pulled up behind his truck and the engine cut out, and for a brief moment, the jungle reclaimed the silence before doors opened, and boots met gravel, and the careful, purposeful sounds of preparation began. Dr. Amara Osei was the first to step into the corridor of space between the two vehicles. She was a small woman, slight through the shoulders, with close-cropped hair and hands that moved with a precision that bordered on musical. 9 years as the reserve's lead veterinarian had given her a particular kind of calm, the sort that did not come from the absence of fear but from a long and intimate familiarity with it. She carried a headlamp pushed up on her forehead, a dart rifle slung across her back by its strap, and a field medical kit that she held in her left hand with the ease of someone carrying a lunchbox. Behind her, 2 junior rangers climbed out of the van's rear compartment and began unloading the transport crate, a heavy wooden and steel frame fitted with a sliding gate and padded interior designed to hold an animal of up to 80 kilograms. They moved without speaking, communicating through gestures and glances, the practiced choreography of a team that had done this many times before and understood that noise was the enemy of every successful intervention. Amara approached Daniel's window and looked past him toward the road's edge. The panther was invisible in the darkness, swallowed entirely by the absence of light, but its presence was undeniable, a gravitational weight in the warm air that both of them could feel without needing to see. "How long since it last moved?" "It hasn't," Daniel said. "Not since I found it. The breathing has been steady, shallow, but consistent." She nodded once, a single downward motion of her chin that contained within it an entire assessment. Steady and shallow meant the animal was not yet in terminal decline, but it also meant the body was conserving everything it had, redirecting resources away from movement and awareness and toward the slow, internal work of keeping blood flowing and organs functioning. It was a body in negotiation with itself, trading one system's needs against another's, and the negotiation would not last forever. She switched on her headlamp and began walking forward. Her steps were deliberate and evenly spaced, each boot placed flat on the gravel to minimize sound, her body low and her movements devoid of any sudden angles. Daniel opened his door and followed, keeping 3 paces behind her and slightly to the left. The 2 rangers stayed back, positioning the transport crate at the rear of the van and waiting for the signal that would bring them forward. The headlamp's beam found the panther at 6 meters. The light moved across the animal's body from tail to head, revealing it in sections, like a curtain being drawn back from a painting. The hind legs, one tucked beneath the body and the other extended with its terrible wound. The torso, ribcage, visible beneath the wet fur with each labored breath. The shoulders, heavy and broad even in this diminished state. And finally the head, turned slightly on the gravel, the jaw relaxed, the ears pressed flat against the skull in a posture that spoke not of aggression but of a profound and total exhaustion. The animal flinched when the light reached its face. A single contraction rippled through the muscles of its neck and shoulders, a reflex so deeply wired into the body's architecture that no amount of fatigue could fully suppress it. The panther's eyes opened, not wide but enough to catch the light and throw it back as 2 points of molten amber, and for a moment the animal was alert, reading the beam and the shapes behind it with whatever fragment of awareness it still possessed. Then the tension drained from its body like water leaving a cracked vessel, and the eyes narrowed again, and the head settled back against the ground with a heaviness that seemed to travel through the gravel itself. Amara crouched slowly, lowering her center of gravity until she was nearly sitting on her heels. She studied the wound through a compact pair of field binoculars, adjusting the focus with her thumb. The wire was clearly visible now, a thin crescent of braided metal buried in the swollen tissue of the inner thigh. The flesh around it had begun to change color, deepening from the red of fresh injury to the darker, more ominous hues of tissue that was losing its battle with bacteria. She estimated the snare had been in place for at least 18 hours, possibly longer. The laceration extended nearly 20 centimeters along the leg, and the edges had begun to curl inward, the body's futile attempt to close a wound that the embedded wire would not allow to close. She unzipped the medical kit and prepared the sedation dart with the focused efficiency of long practice. Ketamine and medetomidine, drawn into separate syringes and combined in the dart chamber at a ratio calculated for the animal's estimated weight. She worked by headlamp, her fingers steady, the vials held at eye level to check the meniscus of each measured dose. The dart itself was a short, feathered cylinder designed to deliver its payload on impact through a spring-loaded plunger, and she loaded it into the rifle's breech with a soft click that sounded, in the silence of the road, like a sentence being completed. She raised the rifle to her shoulder, sighted along the barrel, and placed the dart into the panther's left flank, just behind the ribs, where the muscle was thick enough to absorb the needle without complication. The sound it made was no louder than a hand clap. The panther's body registered the impact with a single sharp twitch, a jolt that traveled from the point of entry through the spine and out to the tips of the limbs, and then the animal was still again, its breathing unchanged, its eyes fixed on some middle distance that held nothing any human could perceive. 4 minutes passed. Amara counted them on her watch, her eyes never leaving the panther. At the 2-minute mark, the animal's breathing deepened, the shallow, guarded rhythm giving way to longer, slower draws of air that expanded the ribcage fully for the first time since Daniel had found it. At 3 minutes, the tension left the limbs, the muscles releasing their grip on the skeleton and allowing the body to settle more completely against the ground. At 4 minutes, the jaw went slack, and a thin line of saliva traced a path from the corner of the mouth to the gravel beneath. The panther was under. Daniel moved forward and knelt beside the animal's head. He did not touch it. He positioned himself close enough that his knee was less than a hand's width from the panther's face, close enough that the animal, if it retained any thread of awareness beneath the sedation, might register the warmth of another body nearby. It was not a medical decision. It was not protocol. It was something older than protocol, something rooted in the same instinct that makes a person sit beside a hospital bed and hold a hand that may or may not feel the holding. Amara knelt at the hind leg and began to work. She irrigated the wound first, using a syringe of sterile saline to flush away the dried blood and debris that had accumulated around the wire. The fluid ran pink and then clear, revealing the true extent of the damage beneath. The wire had cut through the skin and into the subcutaneous fat, and in one section, near the center of the laceration, it had reached the fascia that encased the tendon. She used surgical pliers to grip the wire, her movements impossibly slow, applying pressure in millimeter increments to ease the metal free from the tissue that had begun to grow around it. The wire resisted. It had been in the flesh long enough to become part of the wound's architecture, and removing it was less like extraction and more like archaeology, each movement uncovering a new layer of damage that required its own careful attention. The wire came free in a single piece, 12 centimeters of braided brake cable twisted into a loop that Amara held up briefly in the headlamp's light before dropping it into a plastic evidence bag. She turned back to the wound. The tissue beneath the wire was raw but viable, the blood supply still intact, and the tendon, though compressed and bruised, was unbroken. She cleaned the wound with antiseptic, her fingers working with a gentleness that seemed almost impossible given the gravity of what she was treating, and began to suture the deepest sections with dissolving thread, closing the wound in layers from the inside out. "She's going to keep the leg," Amara said without looking up. Daniel heard the words and felt them settle into the quiet space between his ribs, where the tension had been living for the past hour. He looked down at the panther's face. The sedation had smoothed the animal's features into an expression that was neither pain nor peace, but something neutral and deeply private. The face of a creature that had gone somewhere humans could not follow. The whiskers lay flat against the muzzle. The ears, still pressed back, had softened slightly at their edges. The coat, which from a distance appeared uniformly black, revealed up close its hidden architecture, faint rosette patterns moving beneath the dark pigment like watermarks on black paper, visible only when the light shifted across the fur at exactly the right angle. Then the panther's eyes opened, not fully, not with the alertness of waking, but with the slow, heavy drift of a consciousness surfacing briefly from deep water. The pupils were wide and unfocused, the sedation still holding the body in its careful grip, but the eyes moved, traveling without purpose across the ground and the darkness and the shapes that occupied it until they came to rest, for a moment on Daniel's face. The gaze held no recognition. It held no fear. It held nothing that could be translated into human language without diminishing it. But it held something, a weight, a presence, the simple and irreducible fact of one living creature looking at another and registering that it was there. The moment lasted 2 seconds, perhaps 3. Then the eyes closed again, and the panther sank back beneath the surface of the sedation, and Daniel was left kneeling on the gravel with the night pressing in around him, and the quiet sound of Amara tying off the final suture, and the feeling, strange and unshakable, that something had passed between them that he would carry for the rest of his life without ever being able to explain what it was. "We're ready to move her," Amara said softly. The rangers brought the crate forward. Together, the 4 of them lifted the panther onto a canvas stretcher, supporting the injured leg with a folded towel, and carried her to the crate. She weighed 53 kilograms. Daniel felt every gram of it in his arms and his shoulders, and somewhere deeper than muscle, somewhere in the part of him that understood, without needing to be told, that he was holding a life that had very nearly ended on this road tonight and had not. The truck moved slowly through the darkness, its headlights carving a narrow tunnel of light through the overhanging branches that closed above the road like the interlaced fingers of 2 enormous hands. Daniel drove with both hands on the wheel, keeping the speed below 15 kilometers per hour, feeling every rut and stone through the steering column and adjusting his path to avoid the worst of them. Behind him, secured in the bed of the truck with ratchet straps and padded on all sides with folded canvas, the transport crate held its cargo in silence. He could not see the panther from the cab, but he was aware of her presence the way one is aware of a sleeping child in the next room, a consciousness tuned to a frequency that required no sight or sound, only proximity and attention. Amara followed in the veterinary van, her headlights filling the rearview mirror with a steady glow that accompanied them through the 12-kilometer drive back to the reserve station like a second heartbeat. The rehabilitation enclosure occupied a quiet corner of the eastern compound, set apart from the main station buildings by a stand of mature fig trees, whose canopies spread wide enough to shade the entire structure during the day and shelter it from the heavier rains at night. It was a simple construction, functional rather than elegant, built from treated wooden posts sunk deep into the earth and connected by panels of heavy-gauge wire mesh that allowed air and light to pass freely while containing an animal of considerable strength and determination. The floor was packed laterally with earth compacted over years of use and covered with a layer of dry leaves that the groundskeeper refreshed each week. A shallow water basin sat in one corner, fed by a gravity line from the station's elevated tank, and in the opposite corner, a raised wooden platform provided a surface slightly warmer than the ground for animals recovering from sedation. The enclosure had held duikers, juvenile gorillas, a crowned eagle with a fractured wing, and once, briefly, a forest elephant calf that had been separated from its herd during a flood. It had never held a leopard. They lowered the crate to the ground inside the enclosure and positioned it so the gate faced the interior. Amara checked the panther's vitals one final time through the crate's ventilation slats, pressing a stethoscope against the animal's side and counting heartbeats with her eyes on her watch. The readings were acceptable, not strong, but stable, the body maintaining its minimal operations with the grim efficiency of a system that had learned to function on almost nothing. She adjusted the bandaging on the hind leg, tightening the wrap where it had shifted during transport, and placed a bolus of long-acting antibiotic beneath the skin at the scruff of the neck to begin fighting the infection that had already established itself in the wound. "She'll start coming around in 2 to 3 hours, she told Daniel. "Keep the area dark and quiet. If she shows signs of distress when she wakes, do not enter the enclosure. Call me and I will come back." Daniel nodded. He watched as Amara and the 2 rangers packed their equipment back into the van, their movements efficient and quiet, and drove the short distance to the main station. The generator behind the administration building hummed for another few minutes, and then shut down as someone inside decided that the night's work was done. The compound lights went out one by one, each extinction returning another small piece of the world to the darkness, until the only illumination left was the faint silver wash of a moon obscured by clouds and the even fainter glow of bioluminescent fungi growing along the base of the nearest fig tree, a pale green light so subtle it seemed more imagined than real. Daniel pulled a folding chair from the storage shed adjacent to the enclosure and set it down 5 meters from the mesh wall. He sat. The chair was aluminum and canvas, uncomfortable in the particular way that all field furniture was uncomfortable, designed for portability rather than rest. He settled into it the way a person settles into a long wait, not by getting comfortable but by accepting discomfort as the price of staying. The night air was warm and extraordinarily still, the kind of stillness that occurs in equatorial forests when the wind dies completely and the humidity rises to a point where the atmosphere itself seems to thicken, becoming almost tactile against the skin. Moisture collected on every surface, beading on the mesh wire, on the leaves above, on the backs of Daniel's hands where they rested on his knees. Insects filled the silence with their layered frequencies, a continuous, pulsing architecture of sound that rose and fell in cycles too complex to follow, punctuated at intervals by the singular calls of nightjars and the distant, questioning bark of a tree hyrax somewhere on the ridge above the station. The hours passed with the particular weight that nighttime hours carry when one is awake inside them rather than sleeping through them. Time did not accelerate or slow, but instead became textured, each minute distinct from the one before it, each possessing its own small events and observations. A fruit bat crossed the open sky above the compound at what Daniel estimated was 10:30, its wings broad and membranous against the cloud-filtered moon. A millipede the length of his forearm traversed the ground between his chair and the enclosure, its hundreds of legs moving in a wave pattern that was mesmerizing in its mechanical perfection. The temperature dropped by degrees, so gradual they were perceptible only in retrospect, the air cooling just enough that the moisture suspended in it began to condense into a thin ground mist that crept along the earth and wound itself around the posts of the enclosure, like something alive and curious. At 12:37, the panther stirred. The sound came first, a low vocalization from deep within the chest, not a growl in the aggressive sense, but something more fundamental, the sound of a body reasserting its claim on consciousness. It was rough and broken, more vibration than voice, and it lasted only a few seconds before fading back into the ambient noise of the night. Daniel leaned forward in his chair. Inside the crate, he could see nothing, the darkness too complete, but he could hear movement now, the faint scrape of claws against the crate's wooden floor, the rustle of the padding shifting as weight redistributed. The panther was waking. Over the next 20 minutes, the sounds increased in frequency and clarity. The animal shifted inside the crate, testing its limbs against the confined space, each movement producing a small percussion of wood and fur and restrained effort. A paw appeared at the crate's open gate, broad and dark, the claws retracted, pressing tentatively against the earth of the enclosure floor, as though testing whether it could be trusted. The paw withdrew. Silence held for nearly a minute. Then the panther emerged. She came out low, her belly nearly touching the ground, her weight distributed across 3 legs, with the injured left hind held slightly aloft, not bearing weight but not dragging either, suspended in a careful compromise between pain and function. Her head was up, ears rotated forward, nostrils working the air with rapid, rhythmic flares that pulled in the scent of everything around her, the wood and wire of the enclosure, the leaves on the floor, the antiseptic on her own wound, the water in the basin, and beyond the mesh, the human sitting motionless in his canvas chair 5 meters away. She turned her head toward Daniel and held her gaze on him for 3 full seconds, her eyes catching the faint moonlight and converting it to amber, and in those 3 seconds, the air between them became something dense and charged, not with danger but with assessment, with the ancient calculus of a wild animal determining whether a nearby presence constituted threat or neutrality. She looked away. She did not flee, did not press against the far wall, did not flatten her ears or bare her teeth. She simply looked away, as though the assessment had been completed and the result had been filed in whatever system a leopard uses to categorize the world into things that must be feared and things that need not be. She limped slowly to the water basin and drank, her tongue working in quick, efficient strokes that sent small ripples across the surface. and Daniel watched the reflected moonlight fracture and reform with each lap, and felt something in his chest release that he had not realized he had been holding. She drank for a long time. Then she moved to the far side of the enclosure and lowered herself to the ground with the exaggerated care of an animal managing a body that had become unreliable, each joint bending slowly, each muscle engaged in the controlled descent. She settled onto her right side, the injured leg uppermost, and let out a long, shuddering exhalation that carried in it the accumulated weight of hours of pain and fear and the desperate expenditure of energy required to survive them. It was then, in the stillness that followed, that Daniel noticed something he had not seen before. The panther had rolled slightly as she lay down, her body shifting to find a position that accommodated the wound, and in doing so, her belly had become visible in a way it had not been when she was standing or curled in the crate. The moonlight, thin as it was, fell across her underside and illuminated a silhouette that made Daniel's breath catch. Her abdomen was distended, not with the irregular bloating of illness or the asymmetrical swelling of internal injury, but with a firm, symmetrical roundness that sat low between her hips, carried with the particular gravity that only one condition produces. The mammary tissue along her underside was slightly enlarged, the nipples more prominent than they would be on a non-reproductive female, and as she breathed, the rounded belly rose and fell with a rhythm that seemed, impossibly, to contain its own secondary rhythm within it, a quieter pulse beneath the pulse, a life inside a life. Daniel sat back in his chair. The realization moved through him slowly, not like a shock but like a tide coming in, each wave carrying the understanding a little further up the shore until it reached a place from which it would not recede. This panther, this shadow cat who had dragged herself out of the forest and onto a road with a poacher's wire buried in her leg, had not been fighting only for herself. She had been carrying the future inside her body, and every agonizing meter she had crawled, every breath she had taken against the pull of shock and blood loss and infection, had been in service of something beyond her own survival, something she could not name or understand, but that her body knew with a certainty deeper than thought and older than language. He sat in the dark with this knowledge and did not speak. The panther's breathing had steadied into the slower cadence of rest, and the mist continued its quiet crawl along the ground, and the insects sang their endless, intricate song, and somewhere above the clouds, the moon moved across the sky with the patience of something that had witnessed 10,000 such nights and would witness 10,000 more. Daniel did not sleep. He sat with his hands on his knees and his eyes on the enclosure and the understanding that the stakes of what had happened on that road had just doubled, settling into him with a weight that was not heavy but was permanent, the kind of weight that changes the shape of a person so gradually that they do not notice, until one day they realize they are no longer the same. The days that followed arranged themselves into a rhythm that was neither routine nor remarkable but something in between, the steady accumulation of small changes that, taken individually, meant very little but together composed a story of a body remembering how to be whole. Amara came twice each day, once at dawn and once in the failing light of early evening, crossing the compound with her medical kit and her quiet competence to check on the panther's progress. She changed the dressings on the hind leg every 48 hours, a procedure that required a low dose of sedation administered through a pole syringe, inserted carefully between the mesh panels, and each time the bandages came away, the wound beneath told a slightly different version of itself. In the first week, the tissue was angry and inflamed, the sutures holding but surrounded by a halo of redness that spoke of infection, still fighting for territory. By the 10th day, the inflammation had begun to recede, the edges of the wound drawing together with the slow determination of a river closing over a stone, new tissue forming in pale pink layers that Amara examined with the satisfaction of someone reading favorable news in a language she had spent years learning to understand. The panther's behavior changed in parallel with her healing, though the changes were subtle enough that only someone watching closely and consistently would have noticed them. In the first days, she remained pressed against the back wall of the enclosure, her body oriented toward the gate, her eyes tracking any movement within her field of vision with the hypervigilant intensity of an animal that had not yet determined whether captivity was a form of safety or a different kind of trap. She ate reluctantly, approaching the food that the rangers placed inside the enclosure only after all humans had withdrawn to a distance she deemed acceptable. And even then, she ate quickly and defensively, her body tense, her ears rotating continuously, ready to abandon the meal at the first sign of threat. But by the second week, the vigilance had softened. She began to eat with less urgency. She began to move around the enclosure with something approaching ease, her circuit of the perimeter becoming less a patrol and more an exploration, her nose investigating the wooden posts, the wire mesh, the texture of the earth in different corners. The limp persisted, and Amara said it likely always would, the damaged tissue around the tendon having healed in a way that slightly altered the mechanics of the joint, but the panther was compensating with the fluid adaptability that characterizes all wild animals, her gait adjusting itself around the impairment until the impairment became simply another feature of how she moved through space. Daniel continued to sit outside the enclosure each evening. He had not missed a single night since the rescue, arriving after his patrol duties were finished and settling into the aluminum chair with the unhurried manner of a man keeping an appointment he had made with himself. He brought nothing with him, no book, no radio, no distraction of any kind. He simply sat, and the panther simply allowed it. The dynamic between them had shifted over the days in ways that were difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. In the beginning, she had watched him with the focused attention of prey monitoring a predator, her body held in a state of readiness that could convert to flight or aggression in an instant. Now she watched him the way she watched the fig tree above the enclosure or the hornbills that landed on the mesh roof in the mornings, with an awareness that was present but unconcerned, the gaze of an animal that has categorized a stimulus and moved on. One evening, during the third week, she lay down on the side of the enclosure nearest his chair, her back to him, her flank rising and falling with the deep, unguarded breathing of an animal at rest. It was not affection. It was not trust in the way humans understand trust, but it was an absence of fear. And in the relationship between a wild predator and a human being, the absence of fear was perhaps the most extraordinary gift either could offer the other. Her belly grew. It was the one change that required no expertise to observe, no veterinary training to interpret. Each day, the roundness became more pronounced, the weight of it altering her center of gravity so that she walked with a slightly wider stance and lay down with increasing care, lowering herself in stages rather than folding to the ground in the single fluid motion that leopards typically employ. Amara monitored the pregnancy through observation rather than intervention, unwilling to subject the animal to unnecessary sedation, and trusting instead in the panther's own body to manage the process that it had been engineered over millennia to manage. She estimated the due date based on the probable stage of gestation at the time of rescue and the rate of abdominal growth since, arriving at a window of 5 to 7 days beginning in the third week of the panther's stay. The morning it happened was unremarkable in every way except the one that mattered. Daniel arrived at the enclosure at 5:15, earlier than usual, drawn from his quarters by a restlessness that he did not analyze or question but simply obeyed. The sky was the color that precedes dawn in the equatorial latitudes, a deep, saturated blue that is neither night nor morning but the threshold between them, the sky holding its breath before committing to the day. The air was cool and damp and perfectly still. The compound was silent, except for the distant sound of water moving through the gravity-fed pipes that supplied the station and the nearer, softer sound of dew falling from leaves onto the roof of the enclosure in irregular, percussive drops. The panther was in the far corner. She was lying on her side, pressed against the junction of two mesh walls, her body curved into a tight crescent. Daniel could see immediately that something had changed. Her breathing was rapid and shallow, her ribcage working with a visible effort that he had not seen since the night of the rescue. Her tail was tucked tight against her body, and her hind legs were extended, the muscles along her thighs contracting in rhythmic waves that moved through her body like weather moving across a landscape. She was in labor. He sat down. He did not reach for his radio. He did not call Amara. This was not a decision born of confidence or certainty, but of something more instinctive, a recognition that the moment unfolding before him belonged to the animal, and that the most respectful thing he could do was bear witness without interference. If something went wrong, he would act. But for now, In the gray half-light of a morning that the rest of the station had not yet woken to meet, he would sit and watch, and let the oldest process in the natural world proceed on its own terms. The first cub arrived at 5:41. The panther's body contracted with a force that lifted her shoulders from the ground. A single powerful convulsion that was followed by a moment of absolute stillness, and then a small dark shape appeared, wet and motionless, on the leaves between her hind legs. The panther twisted her head around and began to clean the cub immediately, her tongue working with long, firm strokes that served the dual purpose of removing the amniotic membrane and stimulating the newborn's circulation. The cub did not move. For 10 seconds, 15, 20, it lay in the damp leaves, while its mother's tongue worked over its body with an urgency that was the closest thing to desperation Daniel had ever seen in an animal's behavior. Then the cub drew its first breath, its tiny ribcage expanded, collapsed, expanded again, and from its miniature body came a sound so thin and high that it barely qualified as sound at all, more a vibration at the upper edge of hearing, the first utterance of a life that had not existed 1 minute earlier, and now, suddenly and irrevocably, did. Daniel realized he had been holding his own breath. He released it slowly, carefully, as though the sound of his exhalation might disturb the scene before him. The cub was impossibly small, no larger than his 2 fists placed side by side, its fur dark and slicked flat against skin that was almost translucent in its newness. Its eyes were sealed shut, and would remain so for days. Its limbs were folded against its body in the compact arrangement of a creature that had only ever known the confined space of its mother's womb. And yet it moved, tiny, uncoordinated contractions of its legs, a slow turning of its head, the instinctive search for warmth and milk that begins before any other learned behavior and that would, if everything went as it should, continue in some form for the rest of its life. The second cub came 14 minutes later. This birth was quicker, the panther's body having remembered the process and performing it with greater efficiency, and the cub emerged already moving, its small limbs working against the air before it had fully left its mother's body. The panther cleaned this one with the same thoroughness she had given the first, her tongue moving methodically from head to tail, and when she was finished, she adjusted her position so that both cubs were pressed against her belly, nestled into the curve of her body where the warmth was greatest and the access to milk was easiest. The cubs found her within minutes, their mouths working blindly against her fur until they located what they were searching for, and then they were feeding, and the enclosure was quiet, and the morning light was beginning to filter through the fig tree's canopy in long, angled shafts that landed on the leaves and the earth and the 3 bodies lying together in the corner like something painted by a hand that understood exactly how much beauty a single frame could hold. Daniel sat without moving. His hands were on his knees, and his eyes were on the enclosure, and his chest held a feeling that he could not have described to anyone who asked. Not because the feeling was complicated, but because it was too simple for words, too elemental. The pure and unprocessed experience of witnessing life assert itself against every odd and obstacle that had been placed in its path. This animal, this shadow cat, had been caught in a wire and left to die on a road in the jungle, and she had survived, and she had healed, and now she lay in a corner of a wooden enclosure, with 2 living creatures pressed against her body that would not exist if a truck had not rounded a bend at the right moment on the right evening, and a man had not stopped to look at a shape in the road. When Amara arrived an hour later, she found Daniel in his chair, sitting in the same position he had occupied since before dawn. He looked up at her, and the expression on his face told her everything before he spoke, but he spoke anyway, because some things deserve to be said aloud even when they are already understood. 2, he said, both healthy. Amara looked past him into the enclosure. She stood very still for a long time, watching the panther and her cubs in the soft morning light, and then she pulled over a second chair and sat down beside Daniel, and neither of them said anything more. The fig tree moved gently above them in a breeze that had arrived with the sunrise, and the compound slowly came to life around them as other rangers woke and began their morning routines, and the world continued its turning, indifferent and magnificent, and in the corner of the enclosure, 3 hearts beat where the night before there had been one. They chose a Tuesday for the release, though the day of the week mattered to no one except the humans who recorded it in their logbooks and would remember it, Years later, not by its date but by the way the morning light fell through the canopy and the way the air smelled of rain that had not yet arrived. 8 weeks had passed since the birth. The cubs had grown with the accelerating urgency that marks all wild young, their sealed eyes opening at 10 days to reveal pale blue irises that would deepen to amber over the coming months. Their first steps taken at 3 weeks on legs that buckled and buckled again with a persistence that owed nothing to courage and everything to biology. By 6 weeks, they were climbing the enclosure's wooden posts, their small claws finding purchase in the bark with an accuracy that no one had demonstrated for them, the knowledge already written into their muscles and tendons like instructions in a language older than memory. They were leopards. Their bodies knew what they were before their minds had any use for the concept. The mother's leg had healed into its final form. The limp remained, a slight hitch in her stride that Amara said would be permanent, the tendon having knitted itself back together in a configuration that was functional but imperfect. It did not slow her. During the final weeks, Amara had hidden food throughout the enclosure in increasingly difficult locations, testing the panther's hunting instincts, and the animal had found every piece with a speed and precision that left no question about her ability to provide for herself and her young in the forest. She was ready. She had been ready, perhaps, for longer than any of them had been willing to admit, and the decision to release her was less a judgment call than an acknowledgement of something that was already true. They transported the family in a single crate to a site 12 kilometers deep in the reserve, a stretch of old-growth forest near a seasonal stream where the canopy was thick, and the nearest human settlement was a 2-day walk through terrain that discouraged casual travel. The morning was overcast, the clouds resting low against the hills, and the forest stood in its patient, vertical silence, waiting for nothing and offering everything. Daniel and Amara carried the crate to a small clearing and set it down on the soft earth. 2 rangers watched from a respectful distance. No one spoke. They opened the gate. The panther stood at the threshold for a long moment, her nose working, her ears turning in slow arcs that mapped the soundscape of the forest around her. The cubs pressed against her hind legs, their small faces appearing beneath her belly, wide-eyed and uncertain. Then she stepped forward, one paw and then another, onto ground that was not packed earth and dry leaves but the living floor of the jungle, damp and layered and teeming with the invisible industry of 1,000 organisms. The cubs followed in her shadow, staying close, their movements mirroring hers with the instinctive fidelity of young animals who understand that their mother's body is the boundary of the known world. She walked to the tree line. She stopped, and she turned her head, just slightly, just enough to bring one amber eye to bear on the clearing behind her, on the open crate, on the man standing beside it with his hands at his sides and his face carrying an expression that he would never fully be able to explain to anyone who had not stood in that clearing on that morning and felt what he felt. The look lasted less than 3 seconds. Then she turned back to the forest and walked into it, and the cubs bounded after her, and the ferns closed behind them, and the undergrowth settled, and they were gone. Daniel stood at the edge of the trees for a long time. The first drops of rain began to fall, landing softly on the leaves around him, on his shoulders, on the place where the panther's paws had pressed their last visible marks into the earth. "Let's go," Amara said quietly. He nodded but did not move, not yet. He looked once more at the place where the green had closed, where 3 lives had disappeared into the world that had made them, and he held the image there behind his ribs, not as something to remember but as something that had become part of him, settled into the architecture of who he was, the way the forest settles into the shape of the hills it covers. The rain fell harder. The jungle received it without complaint, every leaf and branch and root accepting the water as though it had been expected all along. Somewhere beyond the tree line, beyond the ferns and the undergrowth in the deep green dark, a panther walked with her children at her sides, and the forest, ancient and indifferent and unspeakably beautiful, carried them forward into whatever came next.